Hi guys, it's Steffi from the Novelty Corner and welcome back to my channel. This is part 2 of my books beside my bed video for the last 7 days. If you haven't seen the first part of this video, I will leave it linked on the screen, but essentially I film one of these videos every week where I wrap up the last 7 days worth of reading. I have been on holidays, I did read a lot of books, so I broke this up into 2 videos so that we are not sitting here for an hour because nobody's got time for that really. Just a quick recap, this is my reading week from the 22nd until the 30th of September. I read 14 books this week. I started a 15th and DNF'd one. I talked about those 2 books in my previous video. I read a total of 4,560 pages and my yearly reading total is up to 283 books. Continuing on from yesterday's video, the next book that I read was When August Ends by Penelope Ward. I read this for the Contemporary-a-thon challenge to read a 2019 release. So this is a 2019 release. I got it on Kindle and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, which is probably the lowest I've rated any of Penelope Ward's books. Mostly I read her work, her co-authored work with Vi Keeland, but I was very curious about this book anyway, so I picked it up and I read it and it was okay. It is the story of Heather, who is a young woman in her 20s. She has given up her dreams of studying and going out into the world to look after her mother, who is quite seriously depressed. And so Heather looks after the family business, which is a little lake house that they rent out. She's living a very sleepy small town sort of life until Noah rents out the lake house for the summer and she becomes sort of infatuated with him. He's in his 30s, so there is a bit of an age gap romance going on. And he's very hesitant to start anything with her. He's come off a relationship where he knows that he didn't give everything he could to it, and so he's very reluctant to get involved with other people because of his job and his commitment to his career. He's a photographer, so he travels around quite a bit. He's also very cognizant of her age and the fact that she hasn't gone out and lived her life, so he tries to keep his distance, but the circumstances sort of draw them together and they begin a romance. And then things get complicated, as they do in romance books, and then you have your happily ever after at the end, which takes a while to get there because there's some twists and turns and things that go on in this book. It was just fun. It was easy to read. It was not my favorite of Penelope Ward's work, but I'm grateful that I read it, and it was just something to read beside the pool. Then I read A Lesson in Thorns, which is the first book in the Thorn Chapel series by Sierra Simone. This was a 2019 release, also from Kindle. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Everyone's been talking about this recently, so I read this for the community favorite or community member favorite. There's so many people who've talked about it, but off the top of my head, I know Chelsea really enjoyed it, and I think also Jean really liked it as well. And there's a whole stack of people talking about it, mostly that they really enjoyed the first book and that the second book disappointed them in some way. I do have the second book. I'm planning on reading it because I just want to see where I sit on the thoughts of how this story goes. This is a really interesting book. This is very, very adult and is definitely not for younger readers at all. It is about a group of adults who knew each other as children, and they spent a summer at Thorn Chapel, which is this grand old estate. The estate has passed into the possession of Alden, who now owns it and was one of the children there. He's brought everyone back to Thorn Chapel in order to sort of help restore it in some way, although his heart's not really in it, but one of the friends has become a architect, another one is a librarian, and so on and so forth. So everyone's coming back to this place after some sort of strange things happened that summer that they spent there as kids. We spend most of the story following the perspective of Poe, who is a librarian and is called in to help catalogue the vast library at Thorn Chapel. In the past, there was a very sort of weird relationship between her and Alden and one of the other boys, Saint Sebastian. And once they come back, that sort of rekindles and sparks, and it just sort of goes from there. It is a very, very dark romance, very, very graphic in terms of its sexual content. So just beware of that going into it. But it was so deeply atmospheric that I actually couldn't put it down. It was one of those books that just sort of gripped me. There's almost this magical realism element woven through it that I wasn't expecting, but it was just delightful to read. But yes, very, very adult and very graphic. So be aware of that going into it. Then taking a completely different tack, I read The 1,000-Year-Old Boy by Ross Welford, which is a middle grade book. So as far as you can get from A Lesson in Thorns, but it is a 2018 release from HarperCollins and I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. It is the story of Alfie, who is 1,000 years old, but he looks like an 11-year-old boy. When he was a child, he unintentionally / intentionally made himself immortal through these special little beads that grant immortality. And so he spends his life living with his mother, who is also immortal, until the day that she's killed. And then he has to try and find a way to undo his immortality because he's lived 1,000 years as an 11-year-old and no one ever believes him. But then suddenly in this current day and age, people start to question what's happening because he's an 11-year-old boy who's been left on his own, but he's very, very strange to them just in the way that he interacts with people. Along the way, he makes 2 new friends and seeks their help in trying to undo the immortality. I won't say curse because he doesn't really believe it's a curse, and he knew what he was doing when he made himself immortal. But he's decided that he's tired of seeing everyone around him die and he wants to just grow up and have a normal life. And along the way, you've got people who are also searching for this secret to immortality, and it was a fun read. It was really interesting. I know there'll be kids at my school who really enjoy it. It was actually recommended to me by one of the Year 6 boys, and I'm glad that I read it, and I can go back and tell them that I have read it now. I read that for the Contemporary-a-thon challenge to read a book with yellow on the cover. There is just a little bit of yellow on it, so it fit. For the Contemporary-a-thon challenge to read plants on the cover, I read Burnt by Carly Lane. This was a 2015 release from Manga, and I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars, which is probably the lowest rating I've given Carly Lane. I think there were a few things about this book that didn't really sit well with me, but aside from that, it was just a very easy, delightful Australian women's fiction read. It is the story of Sebastian and Rebecca, who were childhood sweethearts in their small country hometown up into their late teens when a really tragic accident befalls them and some of their closest friends. And not being able to deal with the guilt, Sebastian leaves, joins the military, and then later becomes a member of the SAS. And Rebecca never hears from him again. She goes on about her life. She becomes a nurse, gets married, she has 2 children, and then her marriage goes wrong and she leaves her husband and takes her children back to her hometown because she has her family support there. And then Sebastian is injured during the war and is sent home to recover, and he ends up going back to his hometown, and their paths cross because Rebecca has just taken a posting as a nurse at the town hospital. So their paths cross. Sebastian sort of gets to know Rebecca again. They sort of move towards this reconciliation, this way of dealing with what happened to them as children and getting to know each other as adults. And to complicate matters, someone is following Rebecca and essentially stalking her, and she doesn't know who or why. And then this threat then extends to Sebastian, and it's a little bit about how they sort of solve what's going on and who's actually targeting them and why. So from that perspective, it was totally fine. I struggled a little bit with Sebastian's character. For a main character in one of Carly Lane's books, he was a little bit more overbearing than I'm used to. He was very much the alpha character, but he also struggled to really understand where Rebecca was coming from at certain points. So eventually he got there, and he knew that he wasn't always looking at things the way that she would like him to sort of be considerate of, but they sort of got there in the end. So it was an enjoyable story. Again, a very easy holiday read. I can't complain. A couple of weeks ago, I read Sinner by Sierra Simone, which was book 2 in the Priest series. So I decided I would just go back and reread Priest because I finished all of my Contemporary-a-thon reads. So I just decided to keep reading sort of contemporary-ish romance books because honestly, they're easy holiday things to read. And I read Priest by Sierra Simone, which is book 1 in the Priest series. It was published in 2015. My edition was the Kindle edition, and I rated it 3.5 out of 5 stars. I didn't enjoy it as much as I enjoyed Sinner, I don't think. It is the story of a priest who has to decide whether or not he is going to stay a priest due to a relationship with a woman that he meets. The woman is Poppy. She comes in for confession one day, and Tyler, the priest, becomes quite enamored and intrigued by her. And this sort of then becomes an obsession, and it's an obsession for the two of them. And it's all consenting adults and everything like that. And it was a really interesting look at the different viewpoints that people can have on the church and how Tyler felt about his situation between his commitment to the church, but also the fact that he's fallen in love. And it was an interesting read. I don't think the plot was particularly sound. It was interesting, and it's very heavy on the detailed sex. So if that's not your thing, skip it. But at the same time, I enjoyed it. And then the last 2 books that I read, I'm going to talk about together because they are book 1 and 2 in a series, and that is Burn For Me and White Hot by Lona Andrews, books 1 and 2 in the Hidden Legacies series. One of the book clubs that I follow on YouTube is reading Burn For Me, so I knew that it was sort of in the back of my mind that I wanted to read it. And honestly, I just wanted to get back to urban fantasy as well because I've read a lot of romance books, I've read a lot of science fiction books, and I wanted urban fantasy. The books were published in 2014 and 2017 respectively. Book 1 was published by Avon and book 2 was published by HarperCollins, or at least the editions that I had on my Kindle were. and I gave them both 4.5 out of 5 stars. They follow the main character of Nevada Baylor, who is a young woman living in our world, except this version of our world, because it is urban fantasy, is a world where about 150 years ago, people discovered a way to reveal whether or not people had magical abilities. So you were given this thing, this serum or whatever it was, and it did one of 3 things. You either got magical powers, you were turned into a monster because your body reacted badly to it, or nothing happened / you may have died from it. So those things happen. The people who got powers basically went on to form these houses, which are magical dynasties of groups of people. And they're basically the untouchables. They're the highest of the highest class. And then within that, you have your own ranks, and the prime's the highest. The houses are very keen on holding on to their power and keeping power and getting more of it. And that sort of causes a lot of problems in the Hidden Legacy series so far. So Nevada is sort of an everyday person. She has some magical abilities. She can tell whether or not people are lying, and she is a private investigator, and then she is called in to help apprehend a very powerful prime who has the ability to start fires. And she's basically being called in because she's expendable, and if something goes wrong, then it can all be blamed on her. And the reason that she has to take the job is because the people giving it to her have mortgaged her business, so she needs to do that. Her business is basically herself and her family, her mother, her grandmother, her sisters, and her 2 cousins, and they are a delightful, delightful group of people, and I want to find out more about them. As she digs deeper into ways of trying to apprehend the fire starter, she crosses paths with Mad Rogan, who is a very powerful prime from a different house. He is basically a psychopath. He really is. Except he sort of mellows a little bit. He's one of those characters where you just want to know more about him, even though he does horrible, horrible things. But being Ilona Andrews, it's very fun, very fast-paced, very action-heavy. The romance is on point, and it takes a while to get there. There's a lot of fun flirting and banter and stuff like that, which is just delightful. I like that sort of stuff. So the first book is about the fire starter. The second book is about a conspiracy and murder plot. And honestly, the whole thing was just fun. I will be continuing this series, so you're going to hear a lot more about it in the future. So those were all the 14 books that I have read over the last week. Really quickly, I want to go over the stats for September. I won't spend too long on it because this doesn't actually change very much from month to month. Next year, I have plans for how I'm going to do this, so it will be a little bit easier to track. But for now, we'll just keep on going the way that we've been going all year. My genres are still pretty stock standard. Science fiction is the biggest group, fantasy is the next, urban fantasy is creeping up into that as well, which makes me happy. The different formats that I'm reading is a little bit different at the now. There's a little bit more in the audio, and I'm obviously reading more ebooks this year. I'm still mostly reading novels. I'm mostly reading books published in the 2000s, but that's just because it's a lot of my back catalogue and current releases. My publisher wheel makes me happy every time I look at it. Allen and Unwin and Gallant's and Kindle are probably the 3 biggest groups that I read from. I still mostly give things 4 stars, but that's because I'm very picky about what I read. I didn't do too badly in September. I read over 30 books. Thank you, holiday, that definitely helped. I'm definitely reading more female authors this year, and I'm definitely reading more adult books this year than I am the kids middle grade or YA. So that's an interesting change for the last 12 months. So yes, those are my stats, the books that I have read. It's been a big week. In the comments below, let me know if you have read any of these books and what your thoughts are on them. Otherwise, let me know if you're planning on reading any of these books in the future. Alternatively, let me know what you have been reading over the last 7 days. I hope that wherever you are in the world, you're having a wonderful day, and I'll catch you guys in my next video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye guys.